The low rumble of his truck's engine pierced the stillness of the night. As the headlights swept across the quiet suburban street, Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had reached the end of his rope, and he was about to take matters into his own hands. For weeks, he had endured the incessant barking from his neighbor's dog, echoing through the night and robbing him of precious sleep. He had tried everything, politely asking the neighbor to keep the dog quiet, leaving notes, even calling the authorities. But nothing had worked, and his frustration had reached a boiling point. As he pulled into his driveway, Michael's eyes narrowed, focusing on the dark silhouette of his neighbor's house. That dog was going to pay for the torment it had inflicted upon him. He stormed into his garage, emerging moments later with a large, heavy object in his hands. Clutching the object tightly, Michael marched across the lawn, his steps heavy with determination. He paused at the edge of his neighbor's property, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Carefully, he crept towards the source of the incessant barking, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then he saw it, the outline of the dog, pacing back and forth, its relentless yapping piercing the night. Michael gripped the object tighter, his muscles tensing. This was his chance. He raised the object, ready to bring it down with all his might, when a sudden movement caught his eye. The back door of the neighbor's house swung open, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm glow of the kitchen light. Michael froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He had been caught. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" the neighbor shouted, his voice thick with anger. Michael's mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation, but the words caught in his throat. He stood there, the object still raised, his face a mask of guilt and fear. The neighbor stormed towards him, his fists clenched. "You better have a damn good reason for being on my property, buddy," he growled, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Michael knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let the neighbor catch him in the act. With a surge of adrenaline, he swung the object, the heavy metal colliding with the neighbor's shoulder with a sickening thud. The neighbor cried out in pain, stumbling backwards. Michael didn't hesitate. He turned and fled, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get away, to escape the consequences of his actions. As he raced back to his house, Michael could hear the neighbor's shouts echoing through the night, mixed with the frantic barking of the dog. He knew he had gone too far, but the thought of another sleepless night had pushed him over the edge. Once inside, Michael slammed the door behind him, his hands trembling. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. The weight of his actions bore down on him, and he sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The night had taken a dark turn, and Michael was left to face the aftermath of his desperate, impulsive decision. The consequences were sure to follow, and he knew he would have to reckon with them, no matter the cost. The pounding on the front door jolted Michael out of his reverie. He knew it was only a matter of time before the neighbor came calling, and he steeled himself for the confrontation. With a deep breath, Michael opened the door, coming face to face with his furious neighbor. The man's eyes were blazing with rage, and Michael could see the angry red mark on his shoulder where the heavy object had struck him. "What the hell is wrong with you, man?" the neighbor shouted, his voice quivering with anger. "You attacked me on my own property. I should call the cops on you right now." Michael held up his hands, trying to placate the irate man. "Look, I'm sorry. Sorry?" the neighbor interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're sorry. You could have seriously hurt me, you crazy son of a bitch." Michael knew he had to defuse the situation before it escalated further. I know, and I'm truly sorry. The dog, it was keeping me up every night, and I lost it. I wasn't thinking straight." The neighbor scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's no excuse, man. You can't just go around attacking people because you're pissed off. That's not how civilized people handle their problems." Michael nodded, his face flushed with shame. "You're right, you're absolutely right. I shouldn't have done that. I'm really sorry, and I'll pay for any medical expenses you incur. The neighbor eyed him skeptically. Damn right you will. And you better keep your ass off my property from now on, you hear me? I don't want to see your face around here again. Michael nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I understand. It won't happen again, I promise. The neighbor gave him one last withering glare before turning and stalking back to his house, the dog's barking still echoing through the night. Michael closed the door, his mind racing. He had let his frustration get the better of him, and now he was facing the consequences. He knew he had to find a way to make amends, to make things right. But as he sat down on the couch, the weight of his actions bore down on him. He had resorted to violence, to taking the law into his own hands, and it had backfired spectacularly. He had to find a better way to deal with the dog's incessant barking, one that didn't involve physical confrontation. With a sigh, Michael reached for his phone, determined to find a solution that wouldn't land him in even more trouble. He had to find a way to put an end to the dog's barking, but this time, he would do it the right way. The next morning, Michael woke up with a heavy heart. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind, and he knew he had to take action to make amends. As he sipped his coffee, he carefully reviewed his options. He couldn't simply let the dog's barking continue to torment him, but he also couldn't resort to violence again. That had been a reckless and unacceptable response, and he knew he had to find a better way to resolve the issue. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He would record the dog's barking and use it as evidence to address the problem through proper channels. With a renewed sense of purpose, Michael grabbed his phone and headed outside, determined to capture the proof he needed. Carefully, he positioned his phone near the fence, angling it towards his neighbor's yard. The dog was already pacing back and forth, its incessant barking piercing the air. Michael pressed the record button and watched as the digital counter ticked upwards, capturing every agonizing second. After an hour, Michael was satisfied that he had gathered enough evidence. He reviewed the recording, wincing at the volume and duration of the dog's barking. Surely, this would be enough to convince the authorities to take action. With a deep breath, Michael dialed the non-emergency police number. He explained the situation, detailing the sleepless nights, the failed attempts to resolve the issue, and the violent confrontation the previous evening. To his relief, the dispatcher listened attentively and promised to send an officer to investigate. As Michael waited for the police to arrive, he paced back and forth, his mind racing. He knew he had to be careful in how he presented the situation, lest he be seen as the aggressor. He had to demonstrate that he had exhausted all other options and that the dog's barking had become an unreasonable nuisance. When the officer finally arrived, Michael greeted him cordially and invited him inside to listen to the recording. The officer listened intently, his brow furrowing as the dog's relentless barking filled the room. I see, the officer said, his voice grave. This is a serious complaint, and it's clear you've tried to resolve the issue amicably. Let me pay a visit to your neighbor and see if we can't get this taken care of. Michael nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Thank you, officer. I really appreciate you taking the time to look into this. As the officer departed, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had taken the high road, and he was confident that the authorities would be able to resolve the issue in a fair and appropriate manner. Now, he could only wait and hope that his neighbor would finally be compelled to keep the dog quiet. The wait for the officer's return was agonizing for Michael. He paced back and forth in his living room, his mind racing with possibilities. Would the neighbor cooperate? Would the police be able to resolve the issue peacefully? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of a car door slamming outside signaled the officer's return. Michael hurried to the front door, his heart pounding in anticipation. As the officer approached, his expression was unreadable, and Michael felt a knot of dread forming in the pit of his stomach. "Officer, what happened?" he asked, his voice tense. The officer let out a heavy sigh. "Well, I've spoken to your neighbor, and I'm afraid the situation is a bit more complicated than I initially thought. Michael felt his stomach drop. Complicated? What do you mean? The officer cleared his throat. Your neighbor claims that the dog's barking is not a constant problem, and that you've been the one causing the real disturbance. He says you've been yelling and shouting in the middle of the night, which is why he hasn't been able to sleep. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. What? That's not true at all. I've been trying to sleep, but the dog's barking has been keeping me up every night. The officer held up a hand, silencing Michael. I understand your frustration, but your neighbor has presented his own evidence, a recording of you yelling and cursing in the middle of the night. Michael felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. That's impossible. I haven't been yelling or causing any disturbance. This is all because of that damn dog. The officer shook his head. I'm sorry, but without any clear evidence of the dog's barking, it's going to be difficult to take any action. Your neighbor is claiming that you've been the one violating the noise ordinance, and he's threatened to file a complaint against you if the situation continues. Michael's heart sank. He had thought he had the upper hand, but now it seemed that the tables had turned. His neighbor had somehow managed to turn the situation around, painting Michael as the aggressor. So, what happens now? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, I'd advise you to try and find a way to resolve this amicably with your neighbor, the officer said. If the situation continues to escalate, we may have to get the courts involved. But for now, I suggest you both try to find a peaceful solution. With that, the officer turned and headed back to his car, leaving Michael standing in the doorway, his mind reeling. He had thought he had the perfect plan, but somehow his neighbor had managed to outmaneuver him. As the reality of the situation sank in, Michael felt a growing sense of dread. He knew he had to find a way to prove his innocence and put an end to the dog's barking, but the path forward was now clouded in uncertainty. Michael paced back and forth in his living room, his mind racing with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The officer's words had left him feeling blindsided and powerless, and he knew he had to find a way to turn the tables on his conniving neighbor. As he replayed the conversation in his mind, a glimmer of an idea began to take shape. If his neighbor had the audacity to record him in the middle of the night, then surely he could do the same. With a renewed sense of determination, Michael grabbed his phone and headed back outside, determined to catch the dog in the act. He carefully positioned his phone near the fence, angling it towards his neighbor's yard. The dog was still pacing back and forth, its barking piercing the air. Michael pressed the record button and watched as the digital counter ticked upwards, capturing every agonizing second. After several hours, Michael was satisfied that he had gathered enough evidence. He reviewed the footage, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the relentless barking. There was no doubt in his mind that the dog was the source of the disturbance, and he was determined to use this recording to prove his innocence. With a sense of newfound confidence, Michael marched over to his neighbor's house, his finger poised on the play button of his phone. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell, bracing himself for the confrontation. The door swung open, and there stood his neighbor, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Michael held up his phone, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I've got something to show you." The neighbor's brow furrowed as Michael pressed play, the dog's relentless barking filling the air. He watched as the neighbor's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, his eyes widening with each passing second. "This is the real disturbance, not me," Michael said, his voice firm. "I've got hours of footage to prove it. Now, are you going to do something about that dog, or do I need to take this to the authorities?" The neighbor's face flushed with embarrassment, and he shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Look, man, Save it," Michael interrupted, his tone unyielding. "I've tried to handle this civilly, and you've just made things worse. It's time for you to take responsibility for your dog's behavior." The neighbor's shoulders slumped in defeat, and he let out a heavy sigh. All right, I'll see what I can do, But you better keep that phone of yours away from my property, you hear?" Michael nodded, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. "I'll do what I have to in order to get this resolved. Let's hope we don't have to go down that road again." With that, Michael turned and headed back to his house, his steps lighter and his heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. He had finally found a way to shift the balance of power, and he was determined to see this through to the end. In the days that followed, Michael kept a close eye on his neighbor's house, vigilantly monitoring the dog's behavior. He had made his point clear, and he was confident that the neighbor would take steps to address the issue. True to his word, the neighbor seemed to have taken some action. The dog's barking had noticeably decreased, and Michael was finally able to enjoy a few consecutive nights of uninterrupted sleep. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, knowing that his persistent efforts had paid off. However, Michael's sense of triumph was short-lived. One afternoon, as he was tending to his garden, he noticed a strange figure lurking near his backyard fence. Squinting his eyes, he realized it was the neighbor, and he was holding something in his hand. Michael's heart raced as he watched the neighbor carefully place the object near the base of the fence, before quickly retreating back to his own property. Curiosity and suspicion got the better of him, and Michael cautiously approached the spot where the object had been placed. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a small cylindrical device. A camera, he realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. His neighbor had installed a hidden camera, aimed directly at his backyard. Fury and betrayal coursed through Michael's veins. After all the effort he had put into resolving the issue, his neighbor had the audacity to turn the tables and spy on him. This was a clear violation of his privacy, and he knew he had to take action. Without hesitation, Michael reached down and snatched the camera from its perch, his fingers trembling with rage. He stormed back to his house, his mind racing with the implications of this latest development. As he paced back and forth in his living room, clutching the camera in his hand, he knew he had to confront his neighbor once again. This time, he was determined to put an end to the conflict, once and for all. Steeling himself for the confrontation, Michael marched over to his neighbor's house, the camera firmly in his grasp. He pounded on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. When the neighbor finally answered, Michael wasted no time. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, thrusting the camera towards the man's face. "You've got some nerve, spying on me after everything I've done to try and resolve this peacefully." The neighbor's eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice betraying his guilt. "Don't give me that," Michael growled, his voice dripping with venom. "I found your little spy camera, and I'm not going to let you get away with this. This ends now. Do you understand?" The neighbor's expression shifted from surprise to defiance. "You had no right to take that camera, you know. That's my property, and I can do what I want with it." Michael shook his head, his grip on the camera tightening. "Not when it's used to invade my privacy, you can't. This is the last straw, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The tension in the air was palpable, and Michael knew that the situation was dangerously close to escalating once again. He had to find a way to de-escalate the conflict, but his anger and frustration were making it increasingly difficult. As the two men stood there, glaring at each other, Michael knew that the resolution to this conflict was still out of reach. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. The stalemate between Michael and his neighbor seemed unbreakable. Both men stood their ground, unwilling to back down from the confrontation. Michael gripped the camera tightly, his knuckles turning white. "This isn't about your property anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is about the trust and respect between us as neighbors. You violated that, and I'm not going to let it slide." The neighbor's eyes narrowed, his jaw set in a defiant expression. "Trust and respect. You're the one who attacked me on my own property. I'm just trying to protect myself and my home." Michael shook his head, frustration etching across his features. "Protect yourself? By spying on me? That's not how this works. You need to take that camera down and apologize, or I'm going to take this to the authorities." The neighbor scoffed, his arms crossing over his chest. "And what makes you think they're going to take your side? You're the one who's been causing all the trouble around here." Michael felt his blood boil at the neighbor's dismissive tone. "I've got the evidence, remember? The recording of your dog's barking. That's what started all of this, and you know it." The neighbor's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Fine, maybe the dog was an issue. But that doesn't give you the right to assault me or invade my privacy. We're both in the wrong here, and the only way to resolve this is to come to a compromise." Michael paused, considering the neighbor's words. As much as he hated to admit it, the man had a point. They had both escalated the situation, and neither of them was blameless. Letting out a deep breath, Michael loosened his grip on the camera. "All right, fine. What kind of compromise are you suggesting?" The neighbor's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'll take the camera down, and I'll make sure the dog doesn't bark as much. But in exchange, I need you to promise to keep your voice down at night. We both need to make an effort here." Michael nodded, his mind racing as he weighed the offer. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. "Okay, I can do that. But I want you to know that if the dog starts causing problems again, I'm not going to hesitate to take action." The neighbor extended his hand, a tentative smile on his face. "Deal. Let's try to be better neighbors from now on. All right." Michael hesitantly shook the neighbor's hand, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't the outcome he had envisioned, but it was a compromise he could live with. As he turned and headed back to his house, he couldn't help but feel a slight twinge of optimism. Perhaps, with a little effort and goodwill on both sides, they could find a way to coexist peacefully. The road ahead might not be easy, but Michael was determined to make it work, for the sake of his own sanity and for the sake of his community. In the days that followed, Michael noticed a marked improvement in the relationship between him and his neighbor. The dog's barking had diminished significantly, and the neighbor seemed to be making a genuine effort to keep the noise down at night. For his part, Michael had also been mindful of his own behavior, keeping his voice low and avoiding any confrontational situations. The compromise they had reached seemed to be working, and Michael felt a sense of cautious optimism about the future. One evening, as Michael was tending to his garden, he noticed the neighbor approaching. He tensed slightly, unsure of what to expect, but the neighbor's expression was surprisingly friendly. "Hey, Michael," the neighbor said, a small smile on his face. "I just wanted to say thanks for working with me on this whole situation. I know it hasn't been easy, but I really appreciate your willingness to find a solution." Michael nodded, his own lips curling into a hesitant smile. "Well, I'm glad we were able to come to an understanding. It's been a long and frustrating process, but I'm happy we were able to find a way to make it work." The neighbor's smile widened, and he extended his hand. "I'm sorry for the way things went down, man. I know I didn't exactly handle it the best way, but I really do want us to be able to coexist peacefully." Michael shook the neighbor's hand, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I appreciate that, and I'm sorry too. We both made some mistakes, but I'm glad we were able to work it out." The two men stood there, the tension that had once permeated the air now replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the fact that they had been able to find a resolution, without resorting to further conflict or legal action. As the neighbor turned to head back to his own property, Michael called out to him. "Hey, if you ever want to grab a beer or something, I'd be happy to join you." The neighbor paused, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, man, that sounds great. I'll let you know." With that, the neighbor disappeared back into his house, and Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had learned a valuable lesson in the power of compromise and the importance of open communication. As he continued his work in the garden, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few weeks. It had been a tumultuous and emotionally charged experience, but in the end, he had come out the other side with a renewed appreciation for the importance of being a good neighbor. And who knows, he thought to himself, maybe he and his neighbor could even become friends. After all, a little bit of understanding and a willingness to find common ground can go a long way in building a strong and cohesive community.